It's not a gut decision. And I've heard that a ton. I make decisions based on would I want to go for a beer with them? And I'm like, oof, that's a bad idea. Because sometimes the best team members are people you wouldn't necessarily want to go have a beer with, but they're who you want to be in the trenches with.
Most companies still treat culture like a side project, something soft, separate, and secondary to performance. But today's guest, Amy Zimmerman, has spent her career proving that belief is not just wrong, it's expensive. Amy made that bet early, shutting down a successful consulting business to go all in on a fintech named Kabbage, which was later acquired by Amex, and then later holding the line on people decisions most companies abandon under pressure. She now serves as the Chief People Officer at Relay Payments while advising other high-growth startups, and her mission is to tie culture directly to business outcomes. Welcome to People Multiple. I am Jia Ganesh. Here, we unpack how talent decisions act as leading indicators of enterprise value, shaping whether companies scale with strength or stall under pressure. Let's dive in. Welcome, Amy. I just want to start off by talking about something you're super passionate about, which is pickleball. You are as passionate about pickleball as you are about building companies. So, what does pickleball teach you about people and performance that 20 plus years in people leadership hasn't taught you, Amy?
Oh gosh, I feel like I learned so much on the pickleball court. But I would say communication and covering each other essentially, right? And you have to do it without overstepping. So when I think about pickleball and I think about leadership, I think there's a ton of synergies. But I think it's actually one of the most clear mirrors that I've found of what great team dynamics look like. There's one other thing, instant feedback. Every
Mm.
single shot on the court either works or it doesn't work. Similar to leadership, although in leadership, feedback loops are oftentimes a lot slower and sometimes filtered depending on who's providing the feedback. Um, I think the game has probably sharpened my ability to adjust in real time.
I love what you shared, especially the dynamics when you are playing as a doubles. And Amy, because you and I have interacted a lot before this, I know there's something else that you talk about which ties back to what you said. You talk about the last mile conversation. It ties back to what you just said regarding the instant feedback. Do you want to tell our listeners what you mean by that and how it's relevant in high performing teams?
Absolutely. And I'll tell you, I have taken that from the founders at Relay Payments. Ryan and Spencer are so good at saying the last 10%. And that's so difficult for so many people. Think about the times when you've been in a meeting and you've kind of bitten your tongue because you thought, oh, I have so much more to say, but I don't feel comfortable. It doesn't feel safe. This maybe isn't the right forum. And so you just hold it in, but the feedback probably would be really helpful and potentially move things forward a heck of a lot more quickly. And so I'm a massive advocate of saying the last 10%. And obviously you've got to pick your environment and make sure that it's a safe way, you have a safe way to do that. And sometimes it means not doing it in public and taking somebody aside to say the last 10%. But I have found that anytime I've withheld the last 10%, I've been frustrated and or have regretted it. And so I try really hard and really intentionally to say the last 10% and to encourage others to do the same.
That is wonderful that it is big part of the cultures that you've built, Amy. I find this really interesting. I've seen this on your newsletter on LinkedIn, right? You've said publicly that you think the term human resources is borderline insulting because people aren't resources. And looking into your background, Amy, you come from social work and sociology, not necessarily hardcore HR. And you've built one of the most talked about cultures in Atlanta. And I'm referring to Kabbage when it was here before it was acquired by Amex, right? Do you think that outsider lens is what allowed you to see people as a business driver rather than a support function? And did that translate into the outcome that a traditional HR approach wouldn't have produced? Or is that overreaching to think that way?
I think it's spot on. And I would say it even predates Kabbage. My first tech company was a little startup called Visionary Systems. The CEO, Jim Eckstein, he was new, certainly had never been a CEO before. And I had never been in the business world. I was a drug counselor, in fact. And I was able to convince him to give me a shot. I had done a 7-month stint as an agency recruiter. And so I kind of knew enough to be dangerous. And he was a, 18-person company. He was doing all of his own recruiting. And so I said, hey, you go be a CEO, leave the recruiting to me. I can manage the office and do a number of other things that, a startup needs to kind of pull everything together. And I came in with zero HR experience, nothing related to compliance, et cetera. I did it for about 6 months and we got to an inflection point. We did a ton of growing. And he said, listen, I need a director of HR. We're big enough at this point that we need some support. And I was like, okay, I mean, I can probably figure that out. He said,
Mm-hmm.
you're going to need to take some classes. He's like,
Mm.
let's do it right. But we were very like-minded and similar in how we thought about people. And it was treat people like people, not like resources, not like numbers on a spreadsheet, not like a lot of companies tend to ultimately treat people, unfortunately, whether intentionally or otherwise. And so I got lucky, right? I fell into a spot. Somebody took a risk on me. He and I learned together. I did wind up taking some classes, admittedly, fell asleep during some of them because they were super boring. But ultimately, I relied on my gut, and I treated people like people. We actually survived the dot-com bubble and with very, very, very little turnover. And we were not venture backed. So we did not have the deep pockets that a lot of the dot-coms had at the time. We were
Mm-hmm.
bootstrapped. But the reason we kept people when competitors were throwing money at people hand over fist when they had VC dollars that were just flowing, because people appreciated being the transparency that we created, the intentionality that we created. Back then, there were no surveys, there were no
Mm-hmm.
culture index numbers, et cetera. But there was a social worker running the program who cared. And so
Mm.
I dug in and I helped problem solve and I helped unstick people and I helped create transparency and I ran the people function the way I would want to be treated if I were on the other side and trying to do a job and trying to navigate conflict and growth and all the things that we all navigate day to day in our jobs. And it worked. And so I leaned into that and I did more of that. So by the time I got to Kabbage, I could talk for hours about what we built at Kabbage. But it gave me the opportunity after doing all of the learning at VSI to actually really be intentional with what we built and how we executed.
Amy, golden words have never been said before, as well as you said it. Treat people as people, not as numbers on the spreadsheet.
I agree with you. The way companies show up, it feels hard, right? It must be hard because more people would do it if it wasn't. I
Mm-hmm.
have found the opposite. It's not hard. You just have to partner with the right founders. And if it doesn't start at the founder level, it's hard. Because if the founders aren't treating people in that way and you don't align philosophically on that culture as a core tenet of building the business, then you're right, it's really hard. It has been something I've prioritized in all of my interactions with founders that I've supported throughout my entire career. So it's actually been quite easy. It would be hard to do the opposite for me.
So let's dig into that, Amy. What did you see in those founders that made you believe that bet would pay off? Especially with, I believe, the Kabbage founders. You came upon them and they took a bet on you, you took a bet on them. But from your end, how did you know that those are the right people to partner with? And what does it tell you about how much founder quality shapes what a company can ultimately become?
Oh man, it's hugely important. I would say I've had a fair amount of luck. No doubt about that. If I tried to take full credit for all of my good fortune, in terms of founder selection, it would probably be a little arrogant. Jim Eckstein was the very first founder. I stumbled upon him because he hired a friend of mine. I had just moved to Atlanta, and I was running around with her, and she said, "Hey, I have to swing by my new company and pick up my paperwork." I was with her. I mean, how lucky was I that I was in the right place at the right time? And I was bold enough to have the conversation. Spoke to the guy that was doing the paperwork with her and said, "Hey, who handles your recruiting?" And he said, "Oh, Jim, our CEO." And I was like, "Is Jim available? I'd like to talk to him for a few minutes." So certainly I get some credit for being bold. But I was really lucky for being in the right place at the right time. And he needed somebody. He was open to the conversation. He interviewed me on the spot for 20 minutes. He hadn't even been interviewing or hiring for the role. I convinced him he ought to. And he hired me, and kind of the rest was history there. We did a couple, I'm trying to think, it was 4 or 5 years at VSI. TransUnion acquired us. I was retained for 2 years. I had my oldest daughter, left, started my own business consulting. Catherine Petralia, one of the founders at Kabbage, had been somebody I worked with at VSI for a short time before she moved on to do other things. But we maintained that relationship. And so when she founded Kabbage with her co-founders, Rob and Mark, she called me and said, "Hey, we're going to have some money soon and we're going to need some recruiting. Can you help?" I happened to be doing my own thing at that point because I had a newborn and I wanted to hang with her for a couple of years. And so I started consulting in kind of a fractional capacity before the term fractional was in vogue. I was doing fractional work for her and for many other companies that I had, word of mouth, et cetera. And so I had a blast, and Kabbage got to an inflection point, and Catherine said, "It's time to join us full time." And I was like, "What do you mean? I've got this booming business that's doing amazing, and I've got all this flexibility, and I'm home with my baby." Well, at that point, she was not a baby, but her, a couple-year-old kid. And I was having so much fun. And the idea of working for one company wasn't super interesting. But the dynamic that those founders shared was magnetic. Right?
Mm.
There was an energy that was contagious. We were able to really feed off of each other. I knew from the couple years that I supported them in a fractional capacity that our values aligned, that the way I would want to build culture aligned with what they would support and be excited about. Um, and so ultimately I did some soul searching and I was like, I got to do it. I've got to take a chance. I had worked for one startup. The outcome was fantastic. And I was all in on Atlanta tech startups at a very, very early place 26 years ago before we were really on the map.
Mm.
And so, yeah, I did a 10-year stint with Kabbage, up until right before the acquisition by Amex. And it
Mm.
was incredible. Obviously, I learned a ton. I started advising Mark at Roadie prior to Cabbage's exit. And ultimately, Kabbage and Roadie exited within a year of each other to Amex and to UPS,
Mm.
respectively. And so that was exit number 2 and exit number 3 for me on from a people perspective. And so I felt really good about philosophically what I had helped create in all of those organizations.
That's an incredible story, Amy. Well, it takes guts to leave a flourishing consulting business, right? Firstly. And you could only make that leap because you came across the right set of founders who aligned with you on the values that you wanted to inculcate in a culture that you would be entrusted to build. So, yes, it may be luck that all those stars aligned for you, but maybe, as you know, luck doesn't happen by chance. It happens because of the hard work you put in as well. That's what they say. So, uh, we are thrilled to hear about that incredible story that led to 3 successful exits for you, Amy.
I
I
appreciate
want to hone in on Cabbage here. When you were at Cabbage, you had a no asshole policy right from the very beginning. You sat in virtually on every final interview, even when the company hit the 600 plus mark. And most companies abandon that discipline at scale because they convince themselves that they can't afford to. They don't have the time, they don't have the people, they have bigger priorities and initiatives, right? What does abandoning it actually cost, and where does that cost show up in the business? If you can tell us maybe with an example or not, that would be helpful for us.
Absolutely. I'll tell you, all credit for that discipline and that rigor goes to the founders. Very
Mm,
early, we did panel interviews as the final, and it was the culture interview. And what
mm,
we tried to do was myself and all three founders, when possible, but some combination of the founders were usually present for many, many years and as often as possible, even in the end. Um, but it was really important to them. And it was for a couple reasons. One, as you mentioned, it allowed us to ensure that we were identifying the right people that were going to contribute to the culture and not deplete from the culture. It's so critical that you bring the right people in. You can have the best of intentions, but you bring in a couple, what's the saying? Some rotten apples ruin the
hmm.
bunch or whatever.
Yes.
And no truer words in a corporate environment or in a company setting, because it doesn't matter how smart somebody is if they are wreaking havoc with their colleagues, both within their teams and cross functionally. It doesn't matter how productive they are. The business will suffer. The people will suffer. People will leave. And so it was really important that we identified folks like that and weeded them out. You can usually, well, that's not fair. Oftentimes you can tell when somebody's super arrogant, and so it didn't matter how smart they were and how well they did otherwise. If we identified somebody as really arrogant, we didn't feel like there was a spot for that kind of ego on the team. Rob, our CEO, used to say, I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself seriously. And so some of what we were looking for were people that could laugh and people that could connect and people that, you know, were serious about their work, but not so serious about themselves. And that was the kind of person that we were looking for. And we had a series of questions that we used that kind of helped us weed people out. The other thing we did was challenge. One of the questions that we would ask is, a biggest weakness question, but something that doesn't make you look good, right?
Mm,
People would default to, oh, one of my biggest weaknesses is I'm
mm,
always on, on the weekends, at
mm.
night, I never disconnect. That's a weakness. And it's like, it's a weakness. But in some environments, that actually makes you look good. I'm so committed to my work that I don't ever take any downtime or step away or take a break. And it's like, well, it sounds like you're on your way to burning out. And so maybe that's not the best fit for the environment. But finding people who are comfortable with having some balance and work really hard when they work, but also are not afraid to spend time with their family or doing things that they love outside of work creates a well-rounded person and is something that's really important. Ultimately, the founder's instincts and my experience with having interviewed at this point many, many thousands of people, I
Mm-hmm.
believe is a additive step. And many companies or many founders or executives can't be bothered, or they don't prioritize how important the step is and for them to potentially participate. And I can see both sides. I can say at Kabbage, it worked really, really well for us. Our
Mm-hmm.
turnover was very low. Our hiring quality was very high. Did we get it right every time? Absolutely not. We absolutely did not get it right every time. I'd love to go into some detail though, where I can share one of the things I did programmatically, that I
Mm-hmm.
created as a result of not getting it right all of the time.
Yeah, we would love to hear that.
Okay. So I created this thing called success criteria. And
Mm-hmm.
effectively what it was a combination of it came from a combination of two things. One was every time I sat in a room and we had all kinds of great ideas all the time. The founders were very innovative, very creative people, And they always had a new thing that was going to be really interesting and was going to be the next big thing at Kabbage. And when they did, they would always invoke one person's name.
Mm-hmm.
And they would say, "Can you hire more X's?" And that was the person's name. And I heard it over and over and over and over again. I'm like, "Man, I can't clone. That's not a thing we do." What I started to do was ask them and others that worked with this particular individual a lot to help me understand the traits and characteristics of this person that were so impactful and so important as to why we wanted to clone this person, why we wanted to hire 10 or 20 more of them. And
Mm-hmm.
as I learned more about the traits and characteristics, I created a scorecard and brought it to the recruiting team and said, "We need to find more people with these traits and characteristics. We can't clone somebody. We all know that. Sadly, that's technology that may exist one day. We're not there yet." Right. So, in the absence of cloning this particular rock star, how do we hire more like him? And so we called it success criteria. One of the things that we believe will make you successful at Kabbage is if you possess these traits and characteristics. I ultimately operationalized that by really infusing it into our culture. It became part of
Mm-hmm.
our values. It became part of, our scorecards. It became part of how we evaluated team members from a performance perspective. It was how we evaluated people and when we considered promotion. It
Mm-hmm.
really became instrumental in all of our people practices. And so as a coach, I coached other leaders and other companies on this same concept. And then, of course, when I joined Relay 5 years ago and I sat with Ryan and Spencer, my amazing founders, we went through the exercise of identifying and defining our values because it was very foundational, right? Success criteria is what we baked in immediately. I was like, this is how we're going to determine who we hire. This is how we're going to onboard people. Part of their orientation, they're going to understand what success looks like at Relay. And they're going to
Mm.
understand through the traits and characteristics that you guys have identified we are looking for, and we're going to put it back so that everyone understands exactly what success looks like and how they get there. And so it has become one of my secret weapons, right? Or not so secret weapons because I've shared it as often as possible. Because I do think it is a core ingredient for how to be successful and ultimately, you know, exit in a way, build a team that allows you to accomplish those things, exits, etc.
Mm-hmm. Amy, there was a ton of valuable information in what you said. And I want to add to that. I will start with the first part of your answer. You talked about the questions that helped you weed out some of the rotten apples, for lack of a better way of saying it, right? And I want to add to that, one of the questions that has helped me is I ask some version of what is some feedback that you've received in your professional life that is difficult to hear at the time that it was given to you, but ultimately has proved to be valuable, right? So that gives me an opportunity to learn if these people are willing to hear feedback and how they act upon it and how they are able to share it. And many a times when I've even brought this up in C-level interviews, and I noticed that at the C-level they hesitate to share, right? Because I think they perceive it as a weakness. But many of the successful people we've been able to bring in at Florence, where I work at, have been able to share what feedback was given to them and how they acted upon it. So that's something I wanted to add to what you just shared.
I love that. Yeah, being self-aware it's vulnerable to share weaknesses,
Hmm.
but I believe it's a superpower. I believe if you're willing to be vulnerable and you're willing to be receptive, there's nothing you can't do professionally. It's when you resist
Absolutely.
feedback. None of us is perfect, and no founder is perfect, and nobody expects perfection from their team members. It's not realistic. And if you do expect perfection from your team members, you're setting yourself up and them up to fail.
Yeah. And that's why they say, right, leadership is actually leading yourself before you can lead others. And to lead yourself, you have to have that level of self-awareness. I recently wrote a LinkedIn post, Amy, and the image that I put on that is a leader hanging on a clothes drying line, because it's almost like leadership is almost like having your insides wrung out to dry, because people are able to see every aspect of who you are as a person, whether
That's
you
right.
acknowledge it or not, right?
And it's easy. I mean, talk about being under um a, a microscope, so to speak.
Yes,
If you're interacting with people who have some intuitiveness, they see through whatever the
absolutely.
thought is that you're trying to present. So you might as well just have the humility and show up as you are and not try to pretend to be somebody who you aren't.
Absolutely, Amy. And I want to comment on the other point you shared about the success criteria and the values, where you try to build a clone of a person necessarily. What we did is, in order to come up with our values, we did something very similar. We said, this was a few years ago, we brought the company together at a retreat event, and we said, we asked the employees, if you could pick the top people that you work with and you want to uh, clone their characteristics and traits and attributes, what would those be? So we had that input collected from every single employee within the organization and use that to come up with our values that we still follow till today. So very similar concept. You talked about bringing it into every people operational process. We didn't go that far, but we definitely brought that input into our value system, which of course governs how we show up at work as well.
I love that. How, out of curiosity, how's that working? I'm a firm believer that people support what they build. And by bringing
Absolutely.
people into the process, do you feel like you guys have a better values-driven culture that people really subscribe to and lean into as a result of the exercise that you did in building them?
No doubt, Amy, and especially our my founder slash CEO Ryan. He doesn't believe in having values written on the wall. He feels like values are things that we live by and we walk by, not just words on a wall, right? So that becomes even more evident in our culture, because we give kudos and we have to call out our values. We reference that in meetings when we talk through some of the situations that we deal with, etc. So it comes up in every conversation, and those who were here at the time that it was done definitely are bought in, they live it, they breathe it. And the newer employees have also come to embody it as well.
Love that. Awesome.
Amy, I want to go back to your Kabbage journey, right? You scaled Kabbage from under 20 people to over 650 people, and that was almost an unicorn acquisition by American Express, right?
Right.
This show, like, the premise of this show is built on the fact that people decisions shape enterprise outcomes. So when you look back at that unicorn valuation and that acquisition, how much of that do you attribute to the people decisions that you and the founders made? And was there a specific decision you'd point to as the one that mattered the most, or was it a whole bunch of decisions?
I think it was the sum of the parts, to be totally honest with you. And, when I started with Kabbage, it was actually just the 3 founders, and they had an intern. So, they had an intern who preceded me, but I was brought in literally, I helped them hire their very first architect who built the first iteration of Kabbage.com. And so it was quite literally the very, very, very beginning. Um, and I do think that being intentional, because they brought me in, it was a very clear commitment to, we're going to build a company where we care about the people and we care about the culture, as evidenced by our very first consultant. I'm going to say not employee, because I was a
Hmm.
consultant when I started, but they're like, we need somebody who knows how to build a people function. We're going to start with recruiting because we need the people before we need the function. Um, but this is somebody who is going to be an important investment, because if we're going to build a successful company, we are product people, we are strategists, we are salespeople, we understand the industry, we understand our customers. What we don't know how to do is recruit and build the people function. And so it was a very intentional investment that they made. Um, And so, yeah, I mean, there's no way anybody could argue that that investment and the intentionality that we, uh, certainly I as my function, but even them as the founders, committed to, and also their commitment to interview the finalist of every single job, as repetitive and as redundant as it got, to hire customer service folks and sales folks. I mean, people where, not that we actually had a low turnover, but there's still high turnover functions, and when
Mm-hmm.
you hire at scale, you have an organization of 650 people. You can imagine how many of those people were operational type people, service, sales,
Mm-hmm.
etc. But yeah, the people function is exponential. I will say, on the good luck side, the bad luck side is we sold during a pandemic,
Mm.
right? So it probably the impact, the negative impact that there was, and hard to imagine with an outcome as good as the one we had to a amazing company like Amex, that there was any downside, but the market conditions were certainly not as favorable as they could have been. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
but we did what was best for the business. And so it made sense for all the reasons. But the people multiplier, I mean, a big part of what Amex wanted was the people. We had a
Mm.
really impressive team, many of whom still work for Amex today, over almost 6 years later.
Wow. Wow. That's a true example of people being multipliers for that business. I want to move us along in your journey as a professional, right? So, after that, you were introduced to Relay Payments Founders, where you currently work, by Michael Cohn, a VC at Overline. He recognized that your approach to people and culture was the right fit for what Ryan and Spencer wanted to build even before you had met them. What does that tell you that an investor made that kind of a call? And what do you wish more investors understood about the people function when they are evaluating an organization?
It's a really smart question. And while I believe investors, many savvy investors, more and more now recognize how important the people are, it's probably still not as big a focus or priority as it ought to be, in my opinion.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, Michael's amazing. I met Michael years prior. He was the Rob, Catherine, and I, the founders at Kabbage, were on a panel at TAG for an event where they were essentially talking about culture and building culture. It was actually a sold out event, standing room only, and it was really fun. And Michael was an amazing, I don't know the word, he was not the facilitator, but he was the MC.
Mm.
And so I met him, and when I left Cabbage, I said, "Hey, I'm gonna take some time off, but I wanna get on your radar. I'm gonna do some fractional work. I'm so passionate about early stage startups." I had had some conversations with later stage, scale stage, right? Not just growth, because early and
Mm-hmm.
growth are really where I am the most passionate. Once you get to 1,000 people, or, even the 650 range with Cabbage, and go beyond to scale, is a little less exciting for me. And I had spoken to a couple companies who were looking for chief people officers when I left Cabbage, that were at that scale stage. And I was like, I don't think I really want to do that again. I'd like to play around with early stage. And I realized that I'm not going to make the same amount of money. And I was really okay with that.
Mm.
I was so passionate about that early and growth stage that it was worth the sacrifice to me. I also realized that many companies in those areas don't necessarily have the same appetite for a full time person. And so I thought, what a perfect kind of area to do fractional work. I can probably handle two or three of those. They each can get the insight and the experience and the work and the rigor and all of the, good stuff, and learn from my mistakes before they make them. Um, and so I reached out to Michael and a couple other folks that I know. And Michael was amazing. He was like, "You've got to meet Ryan and Spencer. You're going to love them. I think they're going to love you, and I think it's going to be a great fit." And I had a couple conversations, and he was spot on. I absolutely adore them. They're two of the smartest guys I've ever met in my entire life, passionate about the industry, super pragmatic, so smart in how they build their business. And we aligned on values. So it was a no brainer for me. I started with them in a fractional capacity. They only had a handful of folks on the team and certainly didn't need anything more. But what they knew to be true was similar to what I shared earlier. They are product experts. No one understands their industry better than they do. Nobody understands and is more passionate about their customers than they are. But they're like, this is probably going to be a big business at some point, and that's not something we have experience doing, building in that regard, nor is it the best use of our time. We need somebody who's done it before. And so they brought me on in a fractional capacity. Within 6 months, they're like, "We want you full time." I said, "I don't think you have enough work for me full time. Why don't we just keep it fractional?" And they had closed a Series A and then opportunistically had closed a Series B a couple months later. And they're like, "'Cause we're about to go and we don't want you distracted by other companies. We want you doing everything you can for this company." And so I joined the rocket ship. December was 5 years. I'm in my sixth year, and everything they said was going to happen is happening. They've got an incredibly high say-do ratio. And we've had a blast. And I've been able to really apply the playbook with the relay flair at Relay, and we've built an amazing company, and we're doing amazing things and, hitting our goals and hitting our milestones and really transforming the industry and being a partner to our customers unlike anything they've had before, because this is notoriously an industry that doesn't really partner with
Mm.
logistics care, like, truck drivers and so forth. They really have had more transactional vendor type relationships historically. We care in a way that our customers aren't used to. So it's been really an amazing journey.
I'm going to draw your attention back to the second part of my question, Amy, because I'm really curious about this. What do you wish more investors understood about the people function when they are evaluating a company?
Um, I wish they understood how important it is.
Mm,
Either they don't. I'm going to give the benefit of the doubt and say they don't necessarily understand it. It's the
mm,
kind of thing the CEO at VSI, my first startup, used to say it all the time. He's like, you don't know what's there. It's like glue. When it works, you're just like, this is awesome. The glue works. But when the glue doesn't work properly and everything falls apart, you're like, oh, yeah, that failed. That didn't work. And so I think when investors are looking to invest in a company, if it appears to be working, they don't really focus on the glue,
mm,
right? They focus on the things that are a little more shiny. Let me look at the product. Let me look at the
mm-hmm,
pack. Let me look at the this. Let me look at that stat. Let me look at that stat. Let me talk to
mm-hmm.
the founders. Ultimately, they're the leaders and the decision makers, and so they back into the other must be working because all of these numbers and all of these conversations seem to point that way. And so, yeah, I believe that sometimes investors probably take for granted the people function, and it would probably serve their investment well, even if they had a conversation or two to poke around and look under the hood a little bit to see what they're actually buying.
So again, back to the work you've been doing at Relay, Amy. You said you joined at the middle of the pandemic, right? In 2020, and almost 5, 6 years into that journey now, and you called Relay a rocket ship, which is amazing. So you've already told us about some of the things that you've done there in terms of the values and success criteria and how that is woven into every aspect of your people operations function. Are there any other decisions that you made very early on that you think has had the biggest impact on what Relay has become so far and helping it shape to be a rocket ship?
There's a handful. I do, not to sound like a broken record, I think it's the intentionality, right?
Mm,
It's knowing what to build. So we have a thing that we say all the time, no surprises. And so showing people what success looks like is super critical to building an environment where people can be successful. A lot of companies don't map that out for people. And so during our orientation, we pull up the covers and we show people, this is how we measure. This is what we look for. This is what you can expect. We have no surprises. If you're not doing well and we're working on a plan to transition you out, you're not going to be surprised to find that out. We have
Mm.
regular one-on-ones. It sounds almost rudimentary, and, people might be nodding right now and saying, oh, yeah, yeah, we do all that. We do all that. We do all that. Um, but my experience with companies and with people is that it's not as obvious and not as clear as people seem to think. Or there's companies that don't feel like they owe their team members that level of transparency. You're here to do X job. We'll give you the information you need to do X job, but you don't necessarily need access to everything, whether it's the company financials or whether it's the company product roadmap or whether it's the 2026 plans or the 2027 targets or whatever it is. And I'm of the opinion that the more you create, the more opportunity you create for folks, the more access you provide, the more bought in people become. And when people are bought in, it's not a transactional relationship. They're a little more committed. They may work a little harder. They may try harder. They may build relationships with their colleagues, which also creates engagement, that creates invention, that creates retention. There's all of these kind of domino effects that happen when you foundationally start and manage and lead in a way that makes sense to people. And go back to one of the very first statements I made, and that was just treat people like people,
Yeah.
right? But how when I say that, people are like, well, what does that mean to you? I'm like, all the things that we're talking about is what that
Yeah.
means to
So part two of that question, Amy, how do you want this to show up in how investors or buyers think about Relay's future value, right? It's one thing for us to sit on the operator side and talk about how people feel more like people and feel psychologically safe and feel motivated, engaged, feel like they want to show up and do their best or go above and beyond. It's one thing to feel like that on the operator side. How would you want that to translate to how investors and buyers look at Relay's future value?
I think it's a leading indicator.
Mm.
If it's not super obvious that engaged, motivated, happy, well-rounded, supported team members that know exactly where they stand and where they're going, and to your point, they're psychologically safe, they have all of those other criteria, um, it should be part of the formula, right? It
Mm.
should be an obvious if the market conditions are right, if the product exists, if the customers exist. If you already have presumably what investors do well is size up the financial opportunity. And so what I'm offering is that if you've checked all of those boxes, just add a box to your checklist and look at how people are showing up. Look at retention rates, or said a different way, turnover. Look at, tenure. Look at things related to programming. When you're talking to your founders about their people, maybe find out how the culture, what the underpinnings of the culture are, whether it's that you have investors talk to your chief people officer, or whether it's that you have some other metrics in place that you can get to some answers without doing that. I don't necessarily have a strong opinion.
Mm-hmm,
But
mm-hmm.
if you care about that and you see the people multiplier as a possible measurement for outcomes, and I believe strongly, I've had 3, and I really believe this will be a big one, and it
Mm.
will be a smart one, and it will be the 4th.
Mm.
Um, I I think it's a no-brainer, and I think there's a very clear formula and a very clear roadmap for all of the ones that preceded this one for me.
Amy, you kind of are laying the foundation for my next question, right? Maybe a little bit of a controversial question too. If people decisions truly shape enterprise outcomes like you mentioned, right, especially in those three examples, but why are most boards still not treating this chief people officer the way they treat the CFO? Or said another way, why are they not treating people as important as the finance numbers, right? What is that gap? Who owns closing it, and what would change the company's outcome if it is closed? I think we touched upon the last part of that a little bit already, but I'm curious, how do you think we can close that gap, and why is there so much importance on this numbers?
I think that the numbers are a very clear indicator, and, like, let's face it, the numbers are the black and white of the business, and investors are investing money in a business, and so the numbers matter in a very meaningful way, as they should. I think the people function lives in the gray, and
Mm,
that's a lot harder to navigate for a lot of people that are very pragmatic and are very numbers driven. um, I think that when there's problems, a lot of times investors will pull up the covers or pull
mhm,
back the covers and try to expose where the problems are. Is it a sales motion? Is it a market motion? Is it a you've got some of the wrong leaders in the roles? They're able to kind of start kind of pinpointing where the opportunities are or where the issues are. But I think when the numbers are there, it's maybe the path of least resistance. Let's start there. If we get there, we're good. We don't have to dig deeper. But if we do have to start digging deeper, then some of the people type issues could present. My argument is start there, right? Start there, because sometimes when you're betting on a founder, that's certainly a bet on a person. Most really successful founders have a team. And so if you're betting on the founder, you're assuming they've got a good team or that they're capable of building a good team. Maybe that's a fair bet. Maybe that's enough. But I do think there's an opportunity there to really understand the people quotient. And some investors totally get it. I work with some all the time. In fact, many of my advisory clients came to me through investors who recognized that some of these companies could use a people leader perspective and made that connection. So I would argue some of them totally get it, but there's others that aren't quite there yet.
So, if CEOs were listening to us today and want their talent strategy to raise their multiple in the next, let's say, 3 to 5 years, what are the first three moves you tell them to make or think about?
Well, the first is you've got to get hiring right. It's a non-starter if you're bringing the wrong people onto the team. And so you've got to get hiring right. The step before that, which we've talked a whole lot about, is really understanding your values, and that helps inform who you hire and how you hire. And so I would say you've got to it's not a gut decision. Who you hire shouldn't be the person that you're looking to go have a beer with at the end of the day. And I've heard that a ton. I make decisions based on, what I wanna go for a beer with them, and I'm like, "Oof, that's a bad idea." Because sometimes the best team members are people you wouldn't necessarily wanna go have a beer with,
Hmm.
but they're who you wanna be in the trenches with, right? They're who you wanna problem solve with and solve, problems and build solutions, etcetera. So there's gotta be a mutual respect, and there's gotta be a connection in that regard, but it doesn't have to be somebody that you've got a lot in common with. In fact, I would argue it should be somebody complementary of your skills, but not a match of your skills. A guy I worked with, the CTO at VSI many years ago, said if there's three of us in a room and we all agree there's two people too many. And I'll never
Well
forget
said.
that. I'm
Yeah.
like, so really understanding who you are from a culture perspective. Secondly, making sure that you're hiring the right people. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
not hiring the right people can create massive setbacks. And then treating people well. It's kind of like
Mm.
customer retention. You spend all this money to acquire a customer. The last thing you want to do is blow it by having
Mm-hmm.
poor customer support or relationships. Same with team members. It's a lot of work to onboard and train. A lot of times,
Mm-hmm.
depending on the role, people aren't productive for months. And you're paying salary for many months before they actually contribute. So you're making a pretty massive investment. Once they're there and they're doing well, it's terrible, very expensive in time and money to lose them. And so making sure that you've built a culture and an environment where people want to stay. They're invested. They tell their families about the company. That's always a good sign. And so those are the things I would say that a founder really should prioritize. I know a lot of times customer issues keep founders up at night, but people issues should play as equal a role, if not bigger.
Amy, recently we had a VP summit, and this is what I presented to the entire leadership team there, which is employees are subscribing to your company every day, every week, every month, right? At any time, just like a subscription product that we all have, Netflix or whatever it is, I may choose to disconnect from Netflix, giving them a 30-day notice, right? The
Right.
same thing happens at organizations as well. We forget that employees can choose to show up to the workplace and they can choose to leave and go somewhere else in search of better service. So goes back to what you said in terms of treating people right, building a culture where they show up because they want to show up, and then getting the right people on board. Not every service is for everybody. As we know, you may be a Hulu subscriber, I may be a Netflix subscriber, right? So you may be a relay payment subscriber, I may be a Florence Healthcare subscriber. There's a reason we show up to where we show up at. And if the company is not able to do their share of things in terms of creating the culture for people to show up, then we can all unsubscribe and go elsewhere.
That's right. It's one of the beautiful things in this country. You think about there's a lot of countries where you have to give multiple months of notice.
Yes.
Unbelievable to me. The reality is it's customary to give notice. And I will say one of the things we do at Relay is we pay people a similar notice period. It's customary in the US to give 2 weeks to your
Mm-hmm.
employer before you move on out of courtesy for transition, et cetera. And we do similar. If we let somebody go because they aren't performing, and remember, no surprises, we commit to
Mm-hmm.
it. So you're never surprised. We still pay you a couple weeks to transition you so that we don't put you out
Mm-hmm.
very suddenly with no income. And that's certainly not something that is required by any state jurisdiction or any federal jurisdiction in this country. But it's one
Mm-hmm.
of the ways that we feel like we do the right thing by treating people like humans.
Mm.
But the idea of having to give these extended notice periods is just wild because when you're checked out, you're checked out. That's doesn't feel like a good fit for anybody.
Yeah, I think in the US here we commonly use the word golden handcuffs, but this is like true handcuffs, not
That's
even
right.
golden at this point.
That's right.
Uh, Amy, we are moving into the closing section here. So I have a rapid fire section and then a closing question. So we are moving into the rapid fire section. So the first one, Amy, is you sat in on virtually every final interview at Kabbage for a decade or more, right? One word or phrase that describes the hire you were most proud of.
Well, let's say the clone.
Hmm.
I mean, I built an entire people programming business on the idea of hiring one guy that everybody wanted to clone.
The one that people want to clone. Yes. Amy, culture or compensation? Which one actually retains people when things get hard?
Always culture. Comp is so temporary. People are
Hmm.
excited about a raise in the moment and then they have amnesia.
Yes. I love that. Um, One thing a founder should never delegate to HR.
I say this to folks all the time. There are things that I make sure my founders present that I could easily present.
Hmm.
But then it becomes an HR issue or an HR
Hmm.
program. And so recognition is, in my mind, I run it, I build it, but I always have the founders share it. It feels a lot more special being recognized by the founder, by the CEO, by the president, than it does from me or somebody on my team. So I think it's great when people teams create function and create programs. Certainly, it's not the founder or CEO's job to do that.
Mm-hmm.
But the visibility and the leadership, oversight, visibility, all of that is really, really critical because people want the recognition and the kudos and the support from the founders.
Good one, Amy. And last one for you. Finish this sentence. A company earns a premium multiple when its people blank.
Love the company. I think when you love the company, you do everything in your power to make it amazing. The multiple comes with the amazing heroic work, and that all comes from when I love it, I'll do anything for it.
Fair, fair. Amy, last question for you today. This is our signature question. In your experience, do people decisions actually move the multiple? And if so, where do you see it the most?
It moves it exponentially. It moves it in every aspect of the business. The customers feel it. I can tell you, we get notes every single day from customers who cannot believe how well they're treated by our customer service reps. So our customers feel it. Our candidates feel it. They come into the office. They're like, the energy in this place is palpable. I want to be a part of this. People actually seem like they're having fun and they enjoy being here. Certainly our investors are seeing it in our quarterly meetings where they see revenue numbers and they see all the other things that indicate a really strong, thriving business. So they're seeing it. I mean, there isn't a place in our business that isn't seeing the exponential impact and multiple of our people. Our people are the foundation and are absolutely driving everything.
Thank you so much, Amy, for coming and sharing some really valuable pieces of information and also your amazing journey through 3 exits.
I appreciate it, Gia. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for listening to People Multiple. If you found today's conversation valuable, don't forget to give us a 5-star review and share it with a colleague or fellow investor. And don't forget to follow the show on Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media using the information on the screen and in the show notes below. This has been a production of the AGN Group. I am Gia Ganesh, and I'll see you next week as we continue to explore how talent shapes multiples.